Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Well, thank you as well. It's very nice to be here, and thank you for turning up. My name's Alan Southern, and I'm from Liverpool. And some of you know May Liverpool. There's a football team, and maybe even the music. Some of you might have even heard of the Beatles. It's a long time ago, but that's where I'm from. Hopefully, you'll be able to understand me, because I do have a Liverpool accent, but I'm going to try and speak slow and posh. Anyway, today I'm going to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and the social economy. And these might be concepts to which you have some knowledge, but if there's anything that you don't understand that I mention, feel free to ask a question later on. We know that there's concern over climate destruction, and it's becoming widespread, and it's intensifying. Back in 1994, before most of you were born, we were concerned with climate change, but the level of intensification that's occurred over the past 20 or 30 years is causing concern across all aspects of society. And in this presentation, what I'd like to cover are the Sustainable Development Goals and their relevance to the social economy. And I'd like to think about how they fit with other ideas about the economy, and then explain how social organisations, social enterprises and the like in the social economy respond to the Sustainable Development Goals. And I've got a couple of examples that we can go through for that. And we can think about what's achieved in the face of a capitalist economy, a market-driven economy. Now, I have a lot of slides to go through today, and hopefully we'll get through them in time. And you may know about this. This is the summary of the Sustainable Development Goals and how the United Nations present them, that it's something that all countries should commit to, and recognising that the problems that they've articulated in the SDGs need to be addressed in some way or form. Nevertheless, just this year, there was lots of concern about how the Sustainable Development Goals were not being addressed, and it's threatening the very foundations of planetary ecosystems, and for the first time, global temperatures were dangerously close to the lower limit of the Paris Agreement. What this shows is that even the United Nations are still articulating problems with all countries trying to reach the targets that are set out in the Sustainable Development Goals. And just last week, some of you may have seen in New York, there was a meeting of a number of leaders. The main topic of conversation, of course, was peace and conflict, both in Ukraine and in the Middle East. But there was a report issued as part of that meeting last week, and the United Nations committed themselves quite fundamentally to say we're not going to accept a future in which dignity and opportunity are denied to half the world's population. So it's a real concern that the Sustainable Development Goals are not being met. And the United Nations are continuously articulating that and saying to respective governments, hey, come on, this is a problem and you're not facing up to that problem. For those of you that don't know, this is the list of Sustainable Development Goals. I'm sure you've seen this infographic previously, and those 17 goals range from no poverty onwards. I'm going to look a little bit at Sustainable Development Goal number 12, responsible consumption and production. And I want to try and give a couple of examples that, kind of seek to address SDG 12. So one of the things that SDG 12 covers is food waste. And there's some amazing figures that's associated with food waste. 19% of all food at the point of consumption or the retail stage was wasted in 2022. And that amounts to over 1 billion metric tons of food available to consumers, and equivalent to 1 billion meals of edible food wasted every day. And that's an enormous amount of food waste. And it's occurring at a time when there's almost 800 million people facing food hunger. So it has an impact on food waste and greenhouse gas emission, and it puts obviously additional strain on ecological biodiversity. SDG 12 also covers waste and recycling, and I'll just give you a couple of examples of this. It was recorded that 62 million metric tons of waste from electronics, so all those phones, when you discard your phone, when the computer gets discarded, when the TV and so on, and you take them to the local tip, 62 million metric tons of waste from electronics in 2022, and that's forecast to rise. And that graphic there shows you the way in which it could rise. And those collection processes have an impact, and often those collection processes take place in the developing world. The West basically exports its waste to developing countries, and some of the practices in terms of recycling that waste are very, very suspect. SDG 12 also covers the extraction and importation of raw materials, how they're used in production and consumption, and tourism and the environmental impact. And some of you may have seen that there's a number of places along the Mediterranean coast where the local people are protesting about the impact of tourism. Also across in the Netherlands too, where in Amsterdam they've tried to restrict the number of ships entering the port. So the tourism and environmental impact is an issue for SDG 12 and responsible consumption and production. And a little bit later on, I want to give a couple of cases about food waste, and also I want to look at the provision of housing as well as a community response to that. And that's about SDG 11, but it's also relevant to SDG 12. While this is going on, there's this desire to continue with economic growth, requiring what's often referred to as a well-oiled economic growth machine. And in this ideal of a well-oiled economic growth machine, in other words, capitalism, there's a number of factors that have to be working perfectly. And that's the ease to which you can form a business, the access to finance, the labour markets need to be flexible so people can hire at ease, and we should say fire at ease as well. But also reward socially useful entrepreneurial activities. And of course, this needs to be undertaken under the rule of law and property and contract rights. Now, these are all measured, and there are various organisations that will tell you where it's easy to start up a business and where it's most difficult to start up a business. But this idea of the pursuit of economic growth is very, very strong, and it persists. And this desire for economic growth, those who articulate ideas around a well-oiled economic growth machine would say governments shouldn't interfere with markets, but what they must do is ensure that the growth of wealth continually increases. Now, we know that that is contradictory with some of the problems with addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. They also argue that governments should discourage rent-seeking behaviour and obviously criminal enterprise, but those unproductive and destructive forms of capitalism, of entrepreneurship, are problematic in many, many nations. For example, the kind of hosting of assets where you can increase profits simply by trading assets and not create anything for the real economy. That becomes problematic, and it's something that we've seen increasingly over the last 40 years. The government should incentivise winners, that are those businesses that are often referred to as unicorns, because they're so hard to identify and they're almost miraculous in nature. But they're those types of businesses that innovate, that are entrepreneurial, that grow and continuously revamp themselves to avoid stagnation. Governments should ensure open trade. This is becoming problematic in the last few years, certainly since 2008 when there was a financial crisis, and trade protection has increased from that point. But perfect capitalism has this entrepreneurial spirit a term that's associated with Joseph Schumpeter. It's about new startup businesses, and it's about responsible large organisations, and they work in some synergy in almost this ideal form for capitalism to continue its growth. And what this does is it gives us this perception, this utopian vision really, of capitalism and a sustainable world. A capitalism that can continue to grow and it supports sustainability at the same time. However, the evidence that we see is that there's actually a slowdown in productivity and innovation across the developed countries at least. And at the same time as that productivity and innovation have become problematic, there's been this continued rise in mean temperature. So we've got ecological problems and we've got problems with the economic system as well. It's almost like a perfect storm. We've got nation-state protectionism, as I've just mentioned, and we've also every country has experienced financial, public health and geopolitical crisis. And there's also deep-rooted levels of inequality across the globe and within nation-states as well. So this kind of parallel development of climate destruction and economic stagnation is very, very real to us in the contemporary world. In my own country, in the UK, these are a couple of charts that have been issued by the Office of Budget Responsibility just in the last month. And what this shows is that unless, and even if we can reduce the increase in global temperature, we're going to have some impact on the economy. So what this graph shows is that if we can maintain a decrease in global temperature below 3 degrees, by 2070, the economic impact on the UK economy will be held to -3%. The UK economy will shrink because of climate change. Yeah? If we can only hold it below 2 degrees, then it is an even bigger impact. It'll shrink by 5%. Now, of course, all things don't stay equal, and the economy continues to grow. But the levels of growth in the UK economy are such that this is a real problem. The UK hasn't been achieving economic growth to this level for a long time now. And if its economy starts to shrink at this level, then people are going to get poorer and services are going to be run down and they're going to be much more difficult to access. So it's societal problems that are caused while this dual kind of problem is taking shape. And again, turning to the UN, they show that only 17% of the SDG targets are on track. Nearly half have shown minimal or moderate progress, and progress over 1/3 has stalled or even regressed. It's not an optimistic scenario that the UN are presenting. The scarring effects of COVID-19 pandemic and escalating conflicts, geopolitical tensions, growing climate chaos are hitting the progression of the Sustainable Development Goals hard. So that's the reality. And rather than that utopian vision, this is what we may be facing is a more dystopian reality of the future, where the magic of marketing comes into play, and we have green power, green aircraft, green packaging, green cars, and these are all talked about, obviously. In response, back in 2015, a group of scientists wrote in the journal Science, and they argued for an urgent need for a new paradigm that integrates the continued development of human societies. They were concerned about the maintenance of the Earth system, and they were worrying that planetary boundaries were being impacted. And they identified 9 of these planetary boundaries, which you mightn't be able to see because I don't think it's as clear up on the screen there, the boundaries. But these are the planetary boundaries that they identified. And they were talking about climate change, impacts on the biosphere, stratospheric ozone depletion, the problems with the oceans, often referred to as the blue commons, and so on, land system change use. And what they were saying is that the integration of these has become problematic because as one of these planetary boundaries are breached, it has an impact across others as well. And you can find on the website there, the Stockholm Resilience Organisation, more information on these planetary boundaries. But again, it shows you that there's evidence, there's concern, there's academic evidence, there's political concern, and the social concern about the fact that we are not addressing these changes in the climate. The integrity of these interconnected boundaries is persistently broken, argued the scientists. This impacts on the holistic stability of the Earth. We've got to find a safe operating space for human activities. And what they're saying there is, you know, the economy needs to change, because at the moment it's not operating in a safe manner. A space does not cause harm to the Earth system. The economy is causing harm to the Earth system. You know, when we have a system that creates so much wealth that an entrepreneur can send himself into space, you know, while others can't be homed, then we've got some sort of problem within that system. And they argued that we've reached a tipping point. And it's led to calls for a different approach to the economy. How can we shape the economy in a different way under these circumstances? So the scientific evidence is there, and economists and other political agitators have started to say, let's think about how we change this economy. Let's think about how we do things differently. One economist, Kate Raworth, and you might have come across the book called Donut Economics, she argued that we can do things differently through her book on donut economics. And she says, what we've got to do really is move the dial on growth. We can't keep chasing economic growth. We've got to move away from measures of gross domestic product, and that measures allegedly wealth. But lots of economists have said it's not measuring the right things. All governments use it, and all governments report on their growth using GDP. Others have started to incorporate different types of measures as well. But Kate Raworth was saying, you know, we've got to move towards an economic system where everyone has access to life essentials. Our focus on GDP is not providing that. So she says, we've got to move from endless growth, you know, this pursuit for endless growth, towards thriving in balance, where you get the economy and the environment and the social systems working in a way that's got some balance to it. And to do this, we need to kind of recognise the power of the market. It's a feature that exists. We've got to have an accountable state, more democracy in how that market operates. And we've got to think about the core role of the household, because that's where life's essentials are experienced. And she argued, and other people such as Robert Reich, who used to be in the Bill Clinton administration, they've argued for policies at what's known as pre-distribution. And pre-distribution is different from distributing wealth. You know, the idea under the present system is wealth's created and then it's distributed through a trickle-down effect. The rich get rich and they spend their money and it trickles down to the poorest. That's the notion we're dealing with. The other idea about distribution is that governments can intervene at some point and say, actually, Mr. Bezos, instead of going up in space, we're going to tax you a little bit more and we're going to distribute that towards our health systems, etc., etc. Now, what Katie Raworth is saying is, instead of doing it that way, because there's pushback all the time from the most wealthy, let's think about how we embed pre-distribution in the economy. And that is to incentivise capitalists to commit to fairness before the wealth generation process begins. So get those entrepreneurs and those capitalists to commit to pre-distribution policies before they create the wealth, and don't argue with them when they've created the wealth that they should give more. Yeah? So that's the kind of ideas of Kate Raworth. Others have argued that instead of continually pursuing ideas about economic growth and growing businesses and growing GDP, let's think about degrowth. Let's actually take an active decision to shrink the economy. And that's the ideas about degrowth. And that challenges the hegemony and the ideology of economic growth. So those who kind of pursue the idea of laissez-faire, free markets, they're challenged by these ideas about degrowth. And they argue for a voluntary reduction of extraction of resources and disposal of waste. So that voluntary reduction of extraction of resources, for example, that's what's going on when we're creating the electric cars, but it's still going on in the burning of fossil fuels, isn't it? In huge countries like Canada and America, and I know there's some students here from Canada, and you'll know the kind of regions in Canada where that kind of whole extractive process is going on. And for those who argue about degrowth, they say, look, actually degrowth's inevitable, because this contradiction of pursuing the economy and its economic growth and depletion of the world's resources, one of those is finite, and that's the world's resources. So at some point, it's inevitable. There's a finite limit to what you can extract in Alberta, or what you can extract and use in the Middle East in terms of its oil production. And they also argue to reduce high-impact infrastructure, so that when governments are thinking about their infrastructure development, where should we build our new airport? What type of airport should it be? Do we need a third runway? Forget about that. Think about infrastructure in a different way. Think about non-essential goods. Why are we producing them? Industries that rely heavily on extraction, fossil fuel dependency, and the excessive consumption that has swept certainly the Western world in the last 40 years, and latterly some of the emerging economies, particularly China and India. So it's a political choice, they would argue, and it's not market-led. The market is not going to continue to keep giving you economic growth. This is a political choice to pursue it, and you can make it different. Now, often these ideas are presented in abstract form, and they might appear equally as idealist and utopian as the sustainable economic growth that the free marketeers would advocate. Nevertheless, we still need ideas about renewable energy and ecological sustainability, food production based on sustainable practices, social infrastructure, health, education, housing, and mobility, transport, and so on. And for this, there are alternative models of organising the economy. And I'm going to turn to one of these now, and that's the social economy. So the social economy. For some of you, this might be the first time that you've been introduced to that term. Again, for those students that are in Canada, I'm going to mention Montreal in a moment, which is a great example of the social economy. A simple definition of the social economy is here. You can read it for yourselves. But really, it's about organisations that have a social purpose, and that drives them. And they're guided by a set of principles around that social purpose. And they trade, they sell their services or their goods. Social enterprises, worker cooperatives, community businesses, some charities, they all fall into the remit of the social economy. The important thing being that they're organisations that do trade. Well-known examples, one is in Mondragon. That's located in the Basque region in Spain, and it's just kind of southeast of Bilbao, anyone that knows that area. And it's a town-based initiative that was centred around workers' cooperatives, industrial democracy, and some for-profits as well. And this is a large-scale organisational and industrial complex. And a lot of those businesses, big businesses that trade on a global basis, are run by the workers. They're very market savvy, and it's under worker control. It started at Mondragon, initially led by a priest under the then Franco regime, around about the post-war period it was, in the 1940s, early 50s. And it's in a region that's got a very, very strong independence culture. A region that, where there was a group designated as terrorists by the Spanish government right throughout until the 1980s, and only recently has been that whole conflict with ETA, as they were called, has settled down. And Mondragon has cultivated an image about believing capital and labour conflict doesn't exist. But in reality, it does. They're operating in a capitalist society, and they still have, even under worker control, they still have disputes. But what they can do, what they're able to do, is they're able to react to downturns in the global economy in different ways from for-profits. So, for example, if there's a downturn in the production of washing machines, they produce washing machines, then they can shift some of the labour force into the production of something else. Another example is the one I mentioned in Montreal in Quebec. That's a major city in a French province in Canada. And they, going back to the 1980s, and the interesting thing about the Chantier de l'économie sociale is that it emerged from a women's movement, the protests of women, and they managed to kind of develop a whole range of networks that gave birth to the social economy in Montreal. And they're committed now, this is an up-to-date mission of theirs, they're committed to building the plural economy that produces returns for the community and protects the common good as it relates directly to community needs. They have over 11,000 social organisations, social enterprises in their social economy, and it generates 48 billion Canadian dollars. So that's kind of, that's a substantive part of the economy, like Mondragon. One of the things they're famous for is the way in which they've been able to finance their social economy, and the Chantier Trust and the Fonds de Solidarity, two examples of that. And that's where they garnered finance and delivered it to social enterprise. Because when you start up a business, one of the really difficult things to achieve is to get the finance to start up. And often when you start up a business, social enterprise or not, it's the owner-manager that he or she puts the hand in the pocket and they get the credit card out, and that's how they pay the bills. And that isn't sustainable for that business. And the fiducie, the Fonds de Solidarity, they deliver funding into the social economy to those social organisations. And the social economy operates within broader market-led form of capitalism. So these are capitalistic organisations, if you like. But they're alternative in the sense that it offers a response to social problems, including the SDGs. And it does this through the market, through trade. Now, there's an innovation there, if you think about it, that they're actually using trade to reach a social purpose. Often it needs subsidy, but so do for-profits. And some of the big organisations that you'll see advertised in this university, they garner subsidies from governments for various reasons. Often embeds accountability and democracy into the operation, but they're driven by the social mission. Commercial viability is very important, but we find that the founders, the owners, the managers and the employees often of these social enterprises are really committed to the social purpose of the organisation. And where I live, in Liverpool City region, the social economy, it's become a response to austerity and poverty. So this map, it shows you the red are the poorest places in this Liverpool City region. Yeah? And the green are the most affluent. Yeah? The green is where the footballers live. The red is where the supporters live, for example. And the black dots are where the social enterprises are. So what we found when we've done this research is that we find the social enterprises where the poverty exists. And, that's a concern, really, because what they're doing is they're kind of coming in and repairing broken welfare state and a broken market. Nevertheless, it employs a lot of people. It employs 45,000 people and it generates £3 billion per annum. I'm going to use a case from the Liverpool City region to show you what sort of thing these social enterprises do. This is an organisation I know well. It's called Can Cook, Well Fed. And it's a food poverty social enterprise. And it serves the city region of Liverpool and the North Wales area as well. What it does is it prepares and cooks meals from fresh ingredients. It also campaigns against food banks and food waste. The founder of Can Cook, he really has a dislike of food banks and food waste. It campaigns for nutritious foods, and more recently it's led a campaign against ultra-processed foods. And the income generated by grants and donations and sales and contracts, so there's that pie chart, shows you how they generate their income. Those contracts with local governments are important, where they're selling food, to things like pensioner sheltered housing, or schools, or to nurseries, where young children, kindergarten, for example. And over a 16-year period, Can Cook has been operating. It's been in debt for deficit for 6 years, and it's had 10 years in surplus. So it's done quite well. All businesses run a deficit from time to time, and over this period, it's managed to increase its longevity. Here's a short clip from the founder. Hopefully it'll work.
First of all, educate the donor. If we were to donate something to a food bank, we want to know that it's going to get eaten. Now, interestingly, most of the donations are random or of the wrong food, of the wrong advice. So if you educate the donor and give them a good shopping list that will tie into good food that people can make well for themselves, then that education of the donor makes sure that there's no food waste this end. But critically, the middle bit means that every item of food donated means that somebody will get fed well. The second thing for us is, in creating the shopping list, make sure that the package is well thought out and can be cooked regardless of circumstances. That's not happening right now. So there's some good evidence that 40% of everything that is given out at food banks is either not used or thrown away, even though the family is hungry. That's because it's the wrong food and people don't know what to do with it.
So there he was talking about, his opposition to food banks, and he was saying that food banks, when people donate, they don't know what they're donating. It might be a packet of pasta, and it might be a tin of tuna fish, and they don't know. You can't make a nutritious meal from that. He was saying that when those food packages are distributed to the poorest in society, then they can't make a meal out of it, and 40% of it, up to 40% of it, is discarded, it's not used. So he's got a real opposition to the problem with food banks being seen as a charity to help people who can't access food. They're very, very food insecure, and we're not talking about homeless here, we're talking about people who are in households, and in some cases working families, and they can't deliver nutritious food. So what Can Cook has done is they developed this idea of good food areas, and they've argued that obesity is out of control, ultra-processed food is a blight on health, charity doesn't work to address food insecurity, the offer is non-ultra-processed free food. Offer ultra-processed free food in every community as the precursor to good local health. That's the offer of Can Cook. And that should be the baseline for any community, is affordable food that's free of ultra-processed ingredients. And he says, build a food model of good health and well-being and deliver this into the fabric of every community in their community services that's required to feed children or adults. So he's talking really about, again, kindergartens, primary schools, or, with old age pensions. And he developed this model, this good food area model, where, it looks to cater at scale. One of the things about the social economy organisations is they struggle to get to scale. That's why in Mondragon, it's a classic example because they've overcome that, supported by the provincial government, and the same in Montreal. But elsewhere, it's very, very difficult to grow. Get local suppliers in, look for that profit for social benefit, use subsidies. So if you can create a surplus from selling to local authorities to feed pensioners in sheltered housing, use that surplus to invest in food that can be delivered free or cheap to food insecure households. And have your production kitchen. Think about how you can use things like vending machines in communities to provide food, and make sure it's ultra-processed free food ingredients that's used. And that's a kind of image of one of the lockers, one of the vending machines that they're going to put into communities. And what Can Cook tried to do is deliver this through a circular economy approach. And this is a model of the circular economy. That tries to kind of eradicate waste right through this process. And Can Cook have picked this up and they try to do it. So you can see in this ideal model that you design from the design of better products to reduce and produce waste, right the way through to collections and recycled materials. You can create this virtuous circle of the circular economy. And Can Cook have tried to do this in their approach. So you can see from this graphic that, on the right, we see the local supplies, centralised food production, meal lockers, I've just shown you, mobile shops, you take shops out into the community, and so on, and reduce the waste in the packaging, and they're introducing something, other vending machines where people in work, in universities, for example, getting into universities for or workplaces for a market, and we can use recyclable dishes that can be used in a microwave and so on. So we're working hard to kind of reduce the waste in the packaging, reduce the waste in the food process, use fresh ingredients and keep costs low. And that's that kind of social mission that's driving them. They haven't achieved full use of all the products and the materials in the packaging, but that's the ideal to move towards. And it's the pursuit of a social purpose. It's a political drive to address food poverty, but it's become a drive to provide nutritious food, to eradicate food waste, and to drive out ultra-processed food. And Can Cook began its operation by offering training to young mothers in cooking skills. And when they started that up, they realised there was a bigger problem. And that's how it's grown into what it is now over a 16-year period. And there's two critical features to sustain the organisation. They've got to stay true to the social mission of addressing food insecurity, and they've got to make sure that a revenue creates a surplus so that they can reinvest. Now, they're not driven by the Sustainable Development Goals, but they're well aware of that, and they're well aware that they can make an impact in what they do. I want to change and give you an example of another case study, and this is from something I did some research on a couple of years ago, and this is a community-led housing initiative based in a place called Dudley Street in a district called Roxbury in Boston, in America. And it was an Irish-Italian neighbourhood very close to downtown Boston, where at the end of World War II, there was a series of factory closures, and there was a decanting of these white working-class Italian Americans and their families to the suburbs. And that went on right across America in that kind of time, as mortgages were made more available for people to buy houses out of the city. And it becomes, because of that, a neighbourhood of black Americans who came up from the south and also from Cape Verde, kind of in the Atlantic. So the kind of community changed. And with many of those inner city areas in the US, it compounded neglect from various institutions, from local governments, from the private sector, and from other public institutions as well. It was a neighbourhood of low-paid employment or unemployment. It had poor housing, a lack of basic services, a community with a feeling that they'd been left to rot. And it was one of the places where Martin Luther King started one of his marches off in this kind of neighbourhood. Anyway, from this, I'm just going to show you a video that shows what happened after a period of adversity.
The white working class economy in this neighborhood were the city, which was run, of course, by Irish American politicians. And the other institution was the banks. Both of those institutions refused to interact with the newcomers. And I can only explain that as racism.
Individuals that own buildings could not sell them because in reality all of this area had been redlined by the banks. You couldn't get home improvement loans, you couldn't get business loans to keep your businesses open.
More and more houses were being abandoned, and then a number of the owners of those buildings decided that one of the ways that they could get their money back and maybe even make a quick profit was to burn their houses down.
You have to be very careful. Half the times we stayed up half the night hoping that they didn't firebomb the place. That was a threatening. There people moved away then.
You go to sleep at night and you hear the sirens, you go, oh gosh, here we go again, another building's gonna burn down. You get up, you know, you run to the window, you look, sometimes you see it, sometimes you smell it.
I came outside and I saw the father on fire, and no one could put him out. And then they told me they couldn't find home in Cayenne.
I remember kids being dragged out, already dead. Kids being dragged out in flames. The father in flames, running out of the house screaming, and the neighborhood just stunned. You know, and that happened again and again and again.
Every night there was a fire. It's like this block, the next block, the block after that. And each time they'd burn a house, they'd tear it down. You had another vacant lot, so I saw the vacant lots increase. I saw the amount of crap on the vacant lots increase. It just kept getting worse and worse and worse.
So that's what this community looked like, so this adversity. So we had a situation where in this community there was a vacated housing and the landlords were absent, and it was more profitable for the landlords to go and burn the house down overnight in an illegal activity than it was to rent them out, and that's what they did. And then what happened, of course, is the people who had nowhere to live started sleeping in those houses, and a number of them were burned to death. And then, on one occasion, the house next door to a property that was burning down caught fire and 2 children burned to death. So that real adversity led to this community organising. And that young black woman that you saw, she was one of the young people, she was only like you, very young age, who stepped forward and led the transformation of this community. And one of the things that they did was create a way of managing their own housing stock. And it was called a community land trust. And it's one of the most famous community land trusts in the United States. And basically how you get a community land trust, I'm going to skip through these slides quickly because it's very technical, is your community organises, it raises finance, it identifies property, it buys that property, it builds the houses, and it puts into that house a family. And that's all done from a subsidy. Right, so the houses are always affordable, and it's affordable because it retains the subsidy in the land. I'm not going to go into the details, but I'll show you these figures, and this is how it does it. And this is done on a democratic basis as people sit around and determine the rules and constitution of the community land trust. So if you look at the resale value from a house that in year 1 was $125,000 through the community land trust, it reaches, after 15 years of managed growth, $168,000. In contrast, the market comes to $261,000. It keeps the price of the housing affordable. And that works equally if it's a rented accommodation. And here's some examples of the housing that they've built. Condos over shops, 3-bedroomed and 4-bedroomed housing. They've also got other flats, they've got park, they've got an allotment in the top corner there, and a nursery growing lots of different vegetables, which they sell to the restaurants in Boston. Let me come to this one.
Well, we moved off of this.
So at the end of this process, and by, kind of 15, 20 years ago,
I started here when I first moved to Boston, and I know this will probably be where I end up at. It makes it feel like it was 37 years ago, everyone mingling and having a nice time.
I guess the biggest thing happened was when my 11-year-old said to me the night that we moved in that Saturday night, he says, "Mommy, I'm so proud of you." And I was like, I did it, and that was my biggest reward was my son telling me that.
there's the transformation through this community organisation.
How do you develop confidence in a community, in individuals, to speak, to stand up for, to strive, to fight, and to have hope? I I think those are the key challenges. It's not so much what building are you going to build or what social program are you going to change, but it's the people part of it, the part that has people investing themselves to make a difference, to make a change, and to see that hope. That's the challenge.
And that's where not only was it bricks and mortar that regenerated that neighbourhood, but the social and organisation capability of those people. And she was a great example, that young woman. It's a working class district, with black migration, and how the community suffered. And it secured the right to take those parcels of land, and it secured the finance to build properties that it managed in a democratic way and kept costs low. So, in summary from this presentation today, we can say that the drive for economic growth, it's still dominant, but the system we use for this is market-led, and it's failing to deliver to the benefit of all. It's led to social and economic inequality, and we're experiencing environmental degradation and destruction. It isn't sustainable. You don't have to be a degrowth fanatic to see that this system is not sustainable in the way that it is at present. And the SDGs is a kind of illustration, representation of how global leaders understand that we're in unsustainable times. So they're very important, those sustainable development goals, because it's a recognition. In turn, the social economy works within a capitalist framework, but the organisations in it are driven by social purpose. And what we're seeing from a couple of examples there is when they're organised from the bottom up, they address a social need that's immediate, and they often become politicised in the process, but they seek social reform within capitalism. Mainly they lack scale and struggle to commercialise, but I'll give you an example of one in Dudley Street, which has achieved scale, and there's other examples of scale, if the resources can be secured to grow those. The SDGs are a top-down approach trying to reform capitalism using the existing political structures. And they're failing to drive substantive change, and they're open to claims of being cynically manipulated, for example, by governments and by large organisations. They stand in contrast to social organisations driven by social purpose. We know that system change is required, but, can we develop that? A move towards degrowth seems implausible and ideological. We might need to use the market. Can we use trade to demonstrate change and to democratise the economy? And this is where the social economy and those organisations might have some credibility. So I'm going to stop there. I'll say thank you very much for listening, because you've sat for a long while and listened to me talk, but I'm ready to take any questions that you might have. Thank you. Anyone want to ask a question? Let's put your hand up so I can see you. Yeah, over here, yeah. Is there a microphone for him to use, or we just have to shout so I can hear? That's a really good question. What political level should we support the social economy? Well, the European Union has a social economy strand to its work. So it does try to, it does provide financing through grants and projects to support the social economy. But often the social economy work is very, very localised. And we've got to achieve some means by which we can scale up. And you'd think that if the European Union was supportive of the social economy, we'd achieve that scale. But the real thing that stops it is at that local level, the local institutions and the local politicians are always more concerned with other aspects of the economy that they are convinced will deliver growth. And they believe the social economy are there to support social purposes and mop up from some of the welfare cuts that all European economies have experienced. So it's a good question, and we've got to get around that. And the way that we can get around it is by showing, for example, how food poverty organisations like Can Cook can scale up and can deliver and can turn a surplus. They become self-sustaining in their own sense. And we've got to have more of them. And then within that, we have to have the political leadership at local level. And that's got to come from the social economy, but it's also got to come from the city region mayors, the mayors of cities, the mayors of regional provinces. But it's a very good question, and it shows the amount of work that those in the social economy need to do. Has that answered your question? Yeah, that okay? Any other questions? Okay, so yeah. Yeah, that's another good question. Should we have reward incentives that support the social economy, but in particular the circular economy? Yeah, and the answer to that is yes. You know, it is, because, believe it or not, when I was young, you know, like we used to have things like if you had a bottle of juice, when you finished it, you took the bottle back and you were given money. Right? And those sorts of things are very, very simple. So how can institutions adopt those very micro practices that add to the circular economy? Say this university did that. Yeah, you know, when you'd finish your kind of can of Coke or wherever it is, you take it back somewhere, it's recycled, and you achieve, you get an incentive. Yeah, and that would help recycling. Of course, it doesn't stop the production in the first place, does it? So these are some of the kind of minor reforms that we can do to support the circular economy. The social economy, what we've got to look at the social economy for is to look at, like, how can we get the social economy involved in that production process, because they've got a greater propensity to adopt circular economy principles because they can see it as a social mission, right? And if we could get that as well, then I think we'd have a kind of bigger impact. Is that a question? Yeah. Any other questions? You got another one? You got two? That's an interesting and complex question. So the social economy, yeah, it's part of capitalism, right? You know, it's not arguing for the overthrow of capitalism. It's arguing for capitalism to become more social, to have more of a social purpose. So, you know, organisations that work in the social economy, they have to pay their taxes, and their employers pay their taxes, and so on. The problem with taxes and businesses, of course, is, as we know, the large corporates have found very innovative ways of reducing their taxes that they pay. And that's the problem we've got with taxes. But certainly, you know, we should be thinking, at the very least, about how we redistribute some of the investment into the capitalist economy, into social organisations. So where I live, in Liverpool City region, we're trying to do that, yeah? And the Solidarity Funds of Montreal tries to do that. It's government money and it's pension money from trade unions in Montreal and Quebec. You know, so what we've got to do, we've got to be innovative in this way. We've got to think about how we get government grants in, yeah? And argue with the government, look, in my city, you give Jaguar Land Rover 3.5 million to introduce a robotic machine. You give this social enterprise sector that employ 45,000 people £50,000. There's an imbalance there. Can you think about that? You know, that's how we're addressing it with them. The other thing is, we're saying to social investors, philanthropists, please come and invest in our city region. So it's that kind of play to the good-natured capitalists. And we recognise that. Any other questions? Any from up on top? Yeah, go on right at the back. You'll have to shout. Because that's about, the developing world. And look, if you look on the United Nations website and you do a search for social economy, you'll see a report that's written about the African social economy, right? And in Africa, in some respects, some of the kind of politics has become much more progressive than the rest of the world, where there's a pan-African adaptation of support for the social economy. So first off, they're producing some leadership there, right? Of course, in Africa and the underdeveloped nations, that term, the global world, right? They're major importers of the minority world's waste. And I think there needs to be some political recognition of that from the leaders in the Western world, right? And it's the same in South America. In South America, there's some very good examples of social economy organizations. And, they need to be supported as well. The problem that South America has, of course, is who dominates the North American free trade agreements, yeah? It's America, isn't it? And America shapes the economy of Southern America. And, the problems that those South American countries have got with the IMF is really a kind of burden on their economies. There's great examples in Argentina of workers' cooperatives. They're under increased pressure now since the change of government in Argentina. So I don't think I can give them any advice because they're at the cutting edge of these issues and actually they could give us some advice. But rest assured that there are activities going on in countries across Africa, in some of the politics in Africa, and in countries of South America where these issues are being organised against, and there's agitation coming from communities to try and address them. Plug into them and see what they say. Okay. Do you have time for any more questions, Isabel? Or okay, so we take one more. One more question. Yes. I've sat in the offices of the city region mayor and the combined authorities, and I've, without being too kind of arrogant, I've told them how to do this, right? And there's a number of ways. So let's take the Porto social economy, and there will be one, I don't know anything about it, but there is a social economy movement in Portugal. We could have, for example, very simply, an app that showed where those social organisations were, particularly if there were consumption initiatives like cafes that were worker cooperatives or community cooperatives. So a simple app would show people where they were. And, if I arrive here as a tourist, I can say, I want to go to somewhere that's sustainable and has a social purpose. I can look on the app and I can consume from those types of places. That's the first one. The second thing that they do is all local governments spend an absolute fortune on marketing. And what they do, what they market, they go to, in my case in Liverpool, they go to China and they say, come and invest in Liverpool. And I said to them, spend some of that money by saying, we're going to become a social economy city like Montreal, like Mondragon, and attract people who are interested in that, in investing, like social philanthropists. So there's two ways that we can do it. And then the third way is for the social economy itself to organise and to become politicised and to start making demands of government and saying, raise our profile. We employ, in my case, 45,000 people. That's more than your manufacturing sector, yet you market them and you don't market us. So there's three simple things, simple social reforms that we could do, and it would change the public perception of what the social economy is. Because now, particularly in the UK, they think the social economy is where people get together of a Sunday and they bake cupcakes and they sell them for charity and they go and give it to kind of the homeless. That's the perception of what the social economy is. And we've shown them these are substantive. They generate £3 billion In Montreal, it's almost 50 billion Canadian dollars just in a small area. You know, they're substantive. We've got to kind of convince them to do that. Okay? Okay, well, thanks for your questions. Thanks for listening. And you've been here such a long time. And I think some of you haven't even had any lunch. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
You could have used this.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
Go on, you use it.
Okay, thank you all for coming, and it was a delight to see you all here. And we'll meet again in the next class, maybe tomorrow. Okay, thank you. Have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.